In the early 1600s, the legal difference between African slaves and white indentured servants was unclear. A few of the earliest African immigrants were treated as indentured servants and gained their freedom. Some of these men even became slave owners themselves. But fear of racial integration led the colonial political class to address the law's vagueness as the number of Africans greatly increased. In 1662, Virginia led the initiative by creating statutes to define the ironclad conditions of slavery for blacks. In this unit, we'll discuss why, as slavery became more commonplace in the southern colonies, how the laws and social structures of these colonies changed to create a strict racial system. Slave codes marked blacks and their children as property for life. In an effort to prevent blacks from learning and mounting a legal defense against their unjust status, some colonies made it a crime to teach a slave to read and write. Not even conversion to Christianity could qualify a slave for freedom. In fact, biblical passages were often quoted to justify slavery and encourage slaves to patiently await the freedom heaven would offer them in the afterlife if they only served faithfully before the day of judgment. Even though the initial decision to import African slaves was largely economic, the demeaning legal and social status of both free and enslaved Africans in the British colonies were clearly shaped by racism. From this point forward, the boundary between freedom and slavery in America was defined by the color of one's skin. Slavery allowed plantation owners to access incredible wealth without the overhead of labor costs. They no longer needed to give their most precious commodity, land, away to indentured servants. The planter class monopolized the South's economic and political power. By the time of the American Revolution, 70% of Virginia's lawmakers, like the Washingtons, Lees, and Fitzhughs, came from the small but powerful group. Far beneath the planter class in economic and political power was the farmer class, the most populous of the South's social classes. In order to compete with planters and fight land exhaustion, farmers co-opt their resources. A group of farmers working together and sharing a small number of slaves were able to eke out a hand-to-mouth living. Lower still were the landless whites, who labored beside African slaves in the field for food and supply rations, or took their chances squatting in the western wilderness without title to the land they farmed. Beneath them were the late-coming indentured servants that labored without hope of gaining a parcel of land. Even though people born into these luckless classes would never own slaves, they became defenders of the slave system because it meant that they would always have one rung on the social ladder lower than the one they occupied. At least white landless laborers could call themselves freemen. Regardless of social class, Southerners lived mostly a rural existence that revolved around the isolated great plantations. Because of the extensive network of rivers and creeks that connected plantation settlements with port cities like Charlestown, infrastructure like roads were slow to develop. The self-sufficiency required to be a farmer meant community institutions like churches and schools were rare in the South. On the whole, Southerners were bred with a strong sense of independence and more religiously tolerant than their northern counterparts. But they were also less literate and less democratic. Sectional differences meant there was no sense of unity between England's northern and southern colonies outside of their common nation of origin. Rice cultivation in colonial South. Rice growing, imported from Africa along with enslaved Africans to work the swampy rice fields, made South Carolina the rice basket of the British Empire. Charlestown, South Carolina. Founded in 1680, Charleston grew to become a bustling seaport, pictured in the drawing done in 1730. Charleston was by then the largest city in the mostly rural southern colonies. It flourished as a seaport for the shipment to England of slave-grown Carolina rice.